My name is Dr. Harrison, and I've been an emergency room physician at St. Mary's Medical Center for over 12 years. In that time, I've seen it all: gunshot wounds, car accidents, overdoses, and trauma that would make most people's blood run cold. As an experienced ER doctor, I pride myself on my ability to stay calm in the face of chaos. The night shifts are always the most unpredictable, but I've grown accustomed to the constant pressure. Saturday nights are often quieter than usual, and this one seemed no different. The team and I were preparing for a slow night, with just a few minor injuries and routine cases filling the beds. But at 2:47 a.m., everything changed. A call came in for an unidentified man. His condition would defy everything I knew about medicine. Little did I know, this case would challenge everything I believed. The ER was eerily quiet for a Saturday night. The usual rush of weekend warriors, those with minor injuries from bar brawls, alcohol-related accidents, and the occasional skateboarder who took one too many risks, hadn't yet arrived. The usual suspects were in: Joe, the night shift nurse, who was quietly sipping his coffee behind the triage desk, and Linda, our charge nurse, who had been with the department for years and could handle the most chaotic situations with a calm that would put even the most seasoned doctor at ease. There were no major calls, no urgent surgeries, just the routine. The first few hours of my shift were spent catching up on paperwork. The hospital lights hummed softly, and I could hear the occasional beep of a machine in the background. The steady rhythm of the ER, a place of constant motion, yet tonight it felt like a world of stillness, the calm before the storm. I didn't mind. There was a strange comfort in knowing that, for now, we were in control of the chaos. I exchanged the usual pleasantries with Dr. Kim, the other doctor on shift, as we discussed the usual small talk about our families, upcoming vacations, and plans for the week. It was a typical night, until we received the first major call. A man in his mid-30s, found unconscious near the riverbank. The paramedics were en route. I glanced over at the clock, 2:47 a.m. The sudden beep of my pager made me sit up straight. The case had a potential for complications. It always did when you didn't have enough information beforehand. The nurses quickly swung into action, pulling out the necessary gear and preparing the trauma bay. But we didn't know yet just how strange this case would be. The patient's identity was unknown. There were no phone calls, no family members, and his clothes showed no identifying labels. The team, as always, was ready for what seemed to be another routine case. The city's heartbeat felt steady, and I couldn't help but wonder how many times I had felt this same quiet anticipation before everything went sideways. I glanced at Linda, who looked up from her station with her typical calm gaze. "Possible drowning victim," she said simply, but her tone hinted at something I hadn't picked up on yet. Drowning cases are common, alcohol-related usually. But she was already preparing for something worse, something that didn't match the typical pattern. As Joe prepped the trauma bay, I could feel the familiar weight of the unknown pressing on my shoulders. The lights overhead flickered briefly, almost as if the building itself was bracing for what was coming. This wasn't just a routine case. I felt it in the air, the stillness before the storm. There was something different about this night, and I couldn't yet figure out why. As I readied myself for the incoming patient, I pushed aside my instincts that told me to prepare for something unusual. I didn't know yet how right those instincts would be. The moment the paramedics wheeled him in, I could sense that something wasn't right. The man was in his early 30s, unconscious, pale with a slight bluish tint to his skin. But what struck me immediately was how unnervingly calm he appeared, despite the situation. He wasn't gasping for breath or struggling in any way. He was too still, and that stillness made my instincts stir uneasily. The paramedics provided the basics. Male, approximately 30 to 35 years old, found by a late-night jogger along the riverbank. They mentioned the usual: hypothermia, and that was it. No medical history. No ID. No wallet. No phone. Just dark jeans, a black sweater, and work boots, clothes without a single tag, label, or any identifying marks. I could feel the tension growing among the team as we began our initial assessments. The patient's vitals were odd. A low heart rate but steady pulse, and hypothermic but not to the degree I would have expected from someone who had supposedly spent time in cold water. His lungs sounded clear, no crackles, no fluid. It didn't make sense. For someone who had been unconscious and in the water, there should have been signs of aspiration, but there were none. As the nurses hooked him up to the monitors and started warming blankets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a typical drowning victim. His body was giving off signals that didn't add up. It felt as though this patient didn't belong in the world of medical reality. This was more than just an injury. It was a puzzle. And I could already feel that the answer wasn't going to be something I could easily explain. As I began the initial examination, I started with the basics. I checked his pulse, which was surprisingly steady for someone in hypothermic shock. His breathing was slow but regular, and his blood pressure, though low, was not dangerously so. These were signs that didn't match the severity of his injuries. If this man had been in the water for an extended period, I would have expected much more dramatic vital signs, shallow breathing, a weak pulse, possibly cardiac arrhythmias. But none of that. It was as if his body had already adapted to a situation it should have been struggling to survive. Next, I moved to check his pupils. I shined a light into them, but there was no reaction. In a typical drowning case, this would have been a red flag. A slow or absent pupil reflex is often one of the first signs of brain injury from lack of oxygen. But his eyes just stayed still, unblinking, almost unnaturally calm. I felt a chill run through me. I ordered standard tests, blood work, chest X-ray, and a CT scan to rule out any internal injuries or neurological damage. The usual process for someone in this condition, especially someone so unresponsive, was to check for signs of trauma that could explain the unresponsiveness. I was expecting to find brain edema, possible congestion in the lungs, or electrolyte imbalances from prolonged exposure to cold. But when the blood work came back, it looked normal. No signs of infection, no elevated white blood cell count, and no abnormalities in his electrolyte levels. His oxygen saturation levels were perfectly fine, which didn't align with the fact that he had been found near drowning, unconscious, and in freezing water. The X-ray was another surprise. There was no sign of pulmonary edema, the fluid buildup you typically find in drowning cases. His lungs were clear, with no visible damage. Normally, in such extreme cases, you'd expect to see some signs of water aspiration or at least fluid in the airways. Yet here we were, with no signs of aspiration at all. I ran through everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. This should have been a classic drowning case. It should have been simple, unconscious, hypothermic, and struggling to breathe. But none of the pieces fit. The patient's vital signs didn't match his supposed condition, and the tests didn't offer any clues. It was as though I was staring at an injury that didn't belong in the world of medicine. Linda, our charge nurse, stood by, waiting for my next move. She could see I was perplexed. I started to feel the weight of her gaze, knowing she had been around long enough to understand that something was off about this case. She spoke quietly. "You think there's something more to this, don't you, Doc?" Her voice was calm, but I could hear the concern beneath it. I paused. Could I be overlooking something? Was I missing the obvious? Or was it possible this case was something beyond my training, something that couldn't be explained by any textbook? The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel a strange unease settling over me. This patient didn't belong in the realm of the predictable. It started slowly at first, almost imperceptible. At around 4 a.m., I was reviewing the patient's chart when I noticed something unusual. His core temperature had risen to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, a surprising increase considering how slowly the body typically responds to warmth after being exposed to cold water for such a long time. Normally, when you're dealing with severe hypothermia, it's hours before you see a rise in temperature, even with aggressive rewarming. But here he was, warming up faster than expected. The trend continued through the next hour, with his temperature steadily climbing despite being kept on the usual rewarming protocols. By 5 a.m., The situation began to feel more like a miracle than anything that could be explained by conventional medical science. His heart rate, which had been sluggish and irregular, suddenly steadied to a normal rhythm of 72 beats per minute, the kind of stability you'd expect from someone who hadn't just been in the throes of hypothermia. I glanced at the blood pressure monitor, which now read 120/80, as steady and unremarkable as any healthy adult's would be. I was confused, to say the least. No one recovers this quickly from such extreme cold, not without severe consequences. How was he improving? What was happening to this man that defied all medical odds? The nurses seemed to sense it too, exchanging puzzled glances as they continued to work with a sense of urgency, unsure of what was really going on. His color improved. He wasn't so pale anymore, but had taken on a healthy rosy glow, and his hands, previously icy cold, were now warm and almost normal in appearance. But it was his eyes that caught my attention most. For the first time since he arrived, the unblinking stare that had unsettled me so much began to soften. His eyes were tracking my movements. He was slowly becoming aware of his surroundings. This was impossible, I thought. How could someone who had been unconscious for hours suddenly show signs of neurological function? I ran through the usual medical explanations. Was it shock that caused his body to respond like this? Could it be that his body was somehow compensating for the lack of oxygen earlier on? I ran through the tests again in my mind. No signs of infection, no electrolyte imbalances, nothing. His lab results were still perfect, even though it made no sense. By 6 a.m., the man was almost fully alert, his eyes following my every move. I approached his bedside carefully, checking his vitals and making small talk, hoping that this sudden recovery was just a bizarre anomaly. But it wasn't. He seemed to be aware of everything around him. He was looking at me like he understood every word I said, but still, there was a sense that he wasn't quite reacting like a normal patient. There was something too sharp in his gaze, something unnervingly intelligent. It felt almost as if he was studying me, analyzing me, rather than simply recovering. Linda approached with a concerned expression. "Dr. Harrison," she said quietly, "are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Her voice was laced with worry. "This doesn't make sense. Not with someone who should be in shock, and not after the condition he was in." I didn't know what to say. The room was filled with the usual sounds of hospital equipment, but for a moment, it felt like the air had thickened with something unspoken. I could feel the tension rising, as if the team was waiting for me to come to a conclusion, but all I could do was stare at the patient, trying to find a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just an unusual case of hypothermia recovery. There was something far more unexplainable at play. By the time it was 7 a.m., something was undeniably wrong. The patient was now fully conscious, and his recovery wasn't just miraculous, it was impossible. I checked his neurological responses again, but the more I examined him, the more I found myself questioning what I was seeing. A patient who had been unresponsive for hours, no signs of struggle, no muscle spasms, now seemed to have an almost unnatural level of awareness. I walked closer to his bed. He was looking at me with a calmness that was so unnervingly deliberate it sent a chill down my spine. "Good morning," I said, half expecting him to mumble or react groggily, but instead, he responded clearly, with an almost precise tone, as if he were completely present. "Good morning, doctor," he said, his voice steady and clear, though he had no reason to be speaking, certainly not after the trauma his body had just endured. I froze. Most trauma patients, especially those who had been through such severe hypothermia, would still be disoriented or drowsy. But this man wasn't just speaking. He was speaking with a clarity that was beyond what I would expect from someone who had just been through an ordeal like this. His strength, the way he moved his hands to adjust the foreline, the way he shifted in his bed, was equally perplexing. His movements were deliberate and controlled, almost too coordinated. My mind raced to understand how this could be happening. I checked his vitals again. Everything was perfect, blood pressure normal, pulse rate stable, temperature rising steadily, but not dangerously. All medical signs pointed to recovery. Yet his physical capabilities seemed out of place. He shouldn't have been able to move with this much strength, not after being found hypothermic and on the brink of death just hours ago. There was no sign of muscle atrophy or weakness from the prolonged cold exposure, no indication that his body had suffered any of the typical consequences of such extreme trauma. I turned to Linda, my charge nurse, who had been observing the patient just as closely. "This isn't normal, right?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, it's not. He should be in shock or at least confused, but he's acting like nothing's wrong." She stepped closer to the patient, running a hand through her hair in frustration. "I've never seen someone come back from hypothermia this fast and without complications. It doesn't make sense." As the minutes ticked by, the mystery deepened. The patient's clarity of thought, his sudden physical strength, and the lack of neurological impairment were beginning to feel like clues. But clues to what? I couldn't quite grasp it. It felt as if I were looking at someone who had been dead, someone who had been brought back to life. But it wasn't that simple. There were no signs of neurological damage, no visible signs of the trauma that should have been impairing his brain, and his physical resilience was simply too much to accept. I was beginning to wonder if this was some kind of medical miracle, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't help but feel like there was more to this case than I could understand. And the more I watched him, the more his inconsistent symptoms seemed to defy reality. What was happening to this patient? Had I just witnessed a miracle, or was something far more unnerving happening, something beyond medical understanding? By the time 9 a.m. rolled around, I began to feel an unease creeping over me, something I couldn't quite put into words. The patient's behavior wasn't just unusual. It was starting to feel almost unnatural. As I stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing his vitals and writing notes in his chart, I felt an undeniable sensation that I was being watched. It wasn't just the normal gaze of a patient trying to make sense of their surroundings. This was different. I turned my head, meeting his eyes, the most striking, almost unnervingly sharp blue eyes I'd ever seen. He was lying there, still and quiet, but his gaze never wavered from me. I had been in this profession long enough to know when someone is disoriented or too dazed to fully track their surroundings. But his eyes were fully focused. His attention was intense, deliberate, and strangely analytical, like he was studying me, weighing my every move. For a moment, I felt a chill run through me. I turned away quickly, trying to brush it off. But the feeling lingered. As I continued to review his test results, I found my movements becoming more cautious. Every step I took, every word I spoke, felt as though it were being carefully observed. It wasn't just that his eyes followed me. It was that his gaze felt invasive, almost as if he could see right through me. At one point, I adjusted the monitoring equipment, and when I glanced back at him, he was staring at the Ford drip with such focused attention that it was almost like he understood the function of the device. It was the kind of knowledge no patient, let alone one who had just regained consciousness, should possess. I tried to engage him, asking, "Do you remember anything from before the accident?" His response came slowly, as though he was deliberately choosing his words. "Not much," he said, his voice calm but too measured. "I remember the water, but only faintly. I remember you were there." I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. How could he know I was there when I had only been informed of the case after he was brought in? The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. My professional training screamed at me to focus on the facts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more mysterious was happening. I looked over at Linda, who stood by the nurse's station, and saw her glance at the patient with the same uneasy expression. She, too, must have felt it, this unsettling awareness in the room. As the minutes ticked by, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It was as if we were no longer the ones in control. The hospital, the ER, the patient, it all felt foreign, as if the rules of reality were shifting. We were no longer just dealing with a man who had survived the impossible. We were dealing with something that felt beyond our understanding. The tension in the room had been building, but it reached a new height when the patient spoke again. He had been silent for hours, But as I approached his bed that afternoon, something had changed. His expression had shifted. He no longer looked simply alert or passive. There was something else in his eyes. It was a knowing look, one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "You're wondering how I know so much about you," he said, breaking the silence. I froze. My blood went cold. How did he know that? I had been trying to push aside the sense of unease that had been growing ever since his arrival. His behavior, his clarity, the way he followed my every movement, it was all starting to feel less like the recovery of a patient and more like the behavior of someone who had been watching, waiting. I forced myself to maintain composure, but my voice came out sharper than I intended. "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at me for a moment, as though he was measuring the weight of his next words. Finally, he said, "You're Dr. Harrison, aren't you? The one who always thinks his way through problems, calculating each move, each possibility." His eyes never left mine, as if he could see through me, as if he could see everything I had ever done. My throat tightened. There was no way he could have known that about me. He had no way of knowing about my methods, my approach to medicine, my personal life. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone in the room. The knowledge he had about me, about my inner thoughts, made the ground beneath me feel unstable. "You've been testing me," he continued, his voice calm but oddly enigmatic. "You were hoping for a simple explanation, weren't you? Maybe a diagnosis you could file away, something familiar. But you won't find it." I took a step back, the sensation of being watched growing stronger. It felt as though his words were filling the air around me, suffocating me. His eyes were fixed on me, not like a patient observing their doctor, but like someone who understood more about me than I cared to admit. "Why are you here?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Because I have to be." I didn't know what that meant. What did he mean by that? He continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more measured, more deliberate. "I didn't drown. Not in the way you think. I wasn't pulled from the water by some random jogger. I was placed there. The river, it's just a cover. I've been waiting for this moment, for you to figure it out." My heart began to race. There was no possible way he could have known what was going on in my mind. There was no way he could have understood that I had been struggling with the case, trying to make sense of things that didn't align. But somehow, it felt as though he knew too much. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was seeing right through me. "You think I was dead, don't you? You think I should have been, after everything I've been through?" He smiled softly, almost as if the truth was a secret only he was privy to. "But I wasn't." My stomach turned. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. This man, this patient who should have been unconscious and barely clinging to life, was talking like someone who knew more than any patient had a right to. He was defying everything I had ever learned in medical school. "I'm not like you," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "I've seen things you can't explain. Things that don't belong in your world." He leaned in slightly, his eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. "And now you'll see them too." A chill ran through me, one that I couldn't shake. I stepped back, feeling the weight of his gaze on me, suffocating me. I had thought I was in control, that I could solve this mystery, but now it felt like I was losing my grip on reality itself. The ER, once a place of rationality, now felt like a dream, a place where the rules of medicine and science no longer applied. "What do you want from me?" I managed to whisper. He leaned back against the pillows, his expression softening, but the mystery in his eyes remained. "Nothing. Just to be understood. And to show you that sometimes, the lines between life and death aren't as clear as you think." The room seemed to close in around me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but I couldn't. His words, his presence, it was all too much. He wasn't just a patient. He was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Before I could respond, Linda's voice broke through the fog. "Dr. Harrison, we need to talk." I turned to her, But as I did, I felt the weight of the patient's gaze on me, as if he was already one step ahead, waiting for what would come next. And for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. The days that followed the incident were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a world that no longer made sense, one where the rules I had relied on for over a decade no longer applied. The patient's sudden recovery, his behavior, the eerie sense that he knew things about me and my world, it all left me shaken, disturbed, and unsure of my place in the world I thought I understood. As the hospital returned to its usual rhythm, I found it hard to focus. Every case seemed trivial, every decision seemed unimportant. I kept replaying the events of that night in my mind, over and over again, hoping that I could find some kind of logical explanation. But each time I came back to the same conclusion: there was no rational explanation for what had happened. The patient hadn't just recovered from severe hypothermia. He had defied the very laws of nature. I spent hours in the quiet corners of the hospital, going over his case files, running through the tests, trying to find something that I had missed. But every time I looked at the results, everything seemed too perfect, too aligned. There was no sign of brain damage, no evidence of oxygen deprivation, nothing to explain how he had gone from being a near-drowning victim to fully functional in such a short amount of time. The more I examined the case, the more I felt that I was up against something unfathomable, something that transcended my professional expertise. Internally, I began to question everything I had believed. I had always prided myself on my rational approach, my ability to look at a problem and break it down into manageable parts. But now, that very approach felt insufficient, almost naive. This wasn't a problem I could just solve with my knowledge. This wasn't a puzzle that fit neatly into any medical textbook. The emotional toll was harder to ignore. I had seen death, trauma, and suffering for years, but this was different. This felt like a violation of everything I had ever known about life and death. I had always believed that medicine had its limits, but now, I wasn't so sure. Was I truly a part of a field that had all the answers, or had I been deluding myself all along? My sense of self began to unravel. Could I still trust my training? Could I still trust myself? I had spent years comforting families, giving them the reassurance that I could fix their loved ones, that I could save them. But the truth was, I didn't have all the answers. And that terrified me. It wasn't just professional doubt that haunted me. It was personal, too. The case had left me grappling with ideas I had never truly considered. What if there were things beyond our understanding, things that science could never explain? What if there was something in the world that existed outside the boundaries of medicine, something that couldn't be diagnosed or treated, only witnessed? The patient had talked about the afterlife, about life beyond the physical realm. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I just treated a man who was no longer entirely human? Or was I being too quick to dismiss what might have been a supernatural experience? Could he have been something otherworldly? The very idea sent a shudder down my spine. Every moment since then had been filled with a deep, existential conflict. I couldn't reconcile what I had seen with my knowledge. And what troubled me even more was that I didn't want to. I didn't want to accept that there was something beyond what I could understand. I had built my career on the belief that science was the answer, that there was always a medical explanation, a diagnosis, and a treatment. But this case had shattered that illusion. Who was I if I couldn't explain this? Who was I if I didn't have the answers? I found myself questioning my place in the medical world, in the world itself. What was the point of everything if things like this could happen, if I could be standing on the edge of something I didn't fully comprehend? What had I truly been dedicating my life to? I thought back to the patient's final words. "Not everything is meant to be understood, doctor. Some things are just beyond your reach." Those words gnawed at me, resonating deep within my soul. Was this his message? Had he been sent to teach me something about the limits of human knowledge, or was he simply the product of my own overactive mind? I couldn't find an answer. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to. Days passed, but the mystery of the patient lingered. He left the hospital the same way he came in. No ID, no answers, and most disturbingly, no trace of the truth. The records I had painstakingly gathered were filled with questions, not explanations. His recovery was a medical impossibility, his actions an enigma I couldn't solve. He was discharged with no word of explanation, no follow-up, and no clue as to his identity. The hospital never heard from him again, and as far as I knew, he had simply vanished into the world, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions. The impact this case had on my career was profound. I had entered the field of emergency medicine to save lives, to be a part of something greater than myself. But now, after what I had witnessed, I found myself questioning my place in that world. What did I truly understand? If this case proved anything, it was that our knowledge of life and death was incomplete. In that moment, I realized just how little I really knew, not only about medicine but about the nature of reality itself. Every day I returned to the ER, I found myself haunted by the images of that patient, his piercing eyes, his unsettling calm, and the way he had spoken with such knowing. There were times I would be mid-exam, checking a patient's vitals, and I'd catch myself wondering, are they aware of me? The ghost of the unknown patient had begun to follow me, and it was hard to shake the feeling that I was somehow being tested not just as a doctor, but as a human being. This case, above all, had shaken me to my core. I had always prided myself on the clarity of medicine, the predictability of the human body. I thought I had a mastery of my craft. But now, I saw that mastery as a fragile illusion. I was no longer the calm, confident ER doctor I once was. The foundations of my world had cracked, and no amount of medical knowledge could fill the void left by the impossible. What had I witnessed? Had it been a miracle? Was the patient some sort of supernatural being, someone who had been sent to teach me something? Or was this an anomaly of science that would eventually be explained by future generations? I had no answers, only questions, and each answer I considered only led to more uncertainty. As the days wore on, I began to accept that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some questions would remain unanswered. Perhaps, in the end, that was the lesson. Not everything in this world is meant to be understood, and not every mystery is meant to have an explanation. Some things are simply beyond our grasp. I've come to realize that perhaps the biggest mystery wasn't the patient himself, but the way we, as human beings, view the world around us. Perhaps some of us are meant to ask the questions and never receive the answers. And that's okay. Maybe, as I now understand, some mysteries are simply meant to remain unsolved.